Hello, Mickey D back here with another Star Wars Unlimited video, and today I wanted to talk about something a little bit different. So I wanted to go over today deck building and sideboarding and how they are interweaved. When you go to build a deck, you're not just building a 50 card main deck. That's important to remember. You play as many games in a tournament with your sideboard as without it at minimum. If every match you play goes 2-0, you're playing 50% of your games without your sideboard and 50% of your games with your sideboard. Oftentimes, you're not going to go 2-0 in every match, and so you're probably playing more games with your sideboard than without. And so deck building goes hand in hand with building a sideboard. You're not building a 50 card list, you're building a 60 card list. And there was one card in particular that had me thinking about this theory and just the way I think about cards in this game in general. And that card is Maul. So why did Maul get me thinking about this? Maul is a card that I found myself sideboarding in every single matchup I played. And at that point, you think, why is it not in the main deck? Because if it's in every single matchup, it's got to be good in every single matchup. There's a couple of reasons for that. One of the main ones is that Vader exists. And Vader's a 3 of in my list. And in the main deck, you don't want too many 7-cost ambushes. Maul certainly can be a main deck card. It is totally reasonable to play Maul in your main deck, but I think Vader is just better in this list. It's much more synergistic with Palpatine in general. Should clarify, this whole video is from the perspective of my green Palpatine list, but I think some of the theories can be applied to any list you're playing. And so Vader synergizes better in Palp Green, specifically because of the 9 Sentinels you can get off of it, the Royal Guards, the Phase 3 Dark Troopers, and the Black Sun Starfighters. And there's not as many Underworld cards for your Maul to ping itself with. Vader is kind of, I consider, like a glue card in Palpatine. It's like a core card to your game plan. It's a card you kind of build around. There's a reason I jammed 9 3-cost Sentinels in the list. It's really good with Vader. And that got me to thinking, so there's, in my brain, like 2 major types of cards. There's the glue cards, and then there's the spike cards. Removal is also kind of its own card type, but it's in a bubble on its own, and I wanted to focus on these other 2 today. And so, how do I define these 2 types of cards? Glue cards to me are cards that are the core of your game plan. They're cards you build your deck around. Like your leader is like the quintessential core card, you know. It is the card you're building your deck around technically. And then spike cards are cards that in certain matchups, you put them in your deck, and in certain matchups, they're going to just single-handedly win you the game. And in certain matchups, you draw them immediately and you resource them because they're just dead in the water in those matchups. So for example, in my Emperor Palpatine deck, these are what I consider to be some of the glue cards. Emperor's Royal Guard literally calls out Emperor Palpatine on the card, so it's always going to be a 3/5. It's a Sentinel. It's, I mean, not amazing into every matchup, I'll be honest, but a 3/5 for 3 is never going to be bad. And you kind of build your deck around it. There's a reason I'm playing 9 officials in the list. Emperor's Royal Guard is that reason. Like, I want to make sure this thing has Sentinel as often as possible because that's very powerful. Command is the reason I'm double green. It does almost everything you want it to do in any matchup. In the aggro matchups, it can make your Sentinels harder to kill. It can defeat certain non-unique units. It lets you ramp while impacting the board. In the control matchups, it can help you ramp to get to your late game faster. It can recur some of your biggest threats. It can basically be copies 3, 4, and 5 of Relentless into the control mirrors. And it also can like buff up your Palpatine or any other threat to kind of try and race the game out. So in any matchup, it's exactly what you need it to be. Darth Vader is kind of like, I consider it the bridge card. You can also put Overwhelming Barrage here, but I think Vader is more deck construction warping, if that makes sense. So like, I'm considering Vader more when building my deck around it as compared to Overwhelming Barrage. It bridges you to the late game. It removes the threat while also presenting another or like a sentinel to help block. Similar to command, it can like remove the threat while also stabilizing the board. And in my opinion, Walker is the best overall top end threat. It, like command, does whatever you need it to do in the given matchup. So into the slower decks, if you need just the raw cards, it can do that for you. And in the faster decks, if you need the healing, which you often do, it does that for you. But it's versatile. So sometimes in the aggro decks, if you're stable and you just want to draw cards to try and close the game out, like you peek and you see that critical, overwhelming barrage, you can draw it instead of healing. You don't need to heal in those matchups. And into the aggro decks, if they've started to try and tempo you out post-board, and you need the healing and you're looking at a resupply and you're on 9 resources or whatever, you can bend that and heal 3. So Reinforcement Walker, I feel, is very much like a glue card in this deck. Now for the spike cards. Scanning Officer is an interesting one. It's not fully a spike card, I don't think, because it's hard for a 2-cost 2/3 official to be bad in this list. But oftentimes it is your worst official. Yularen and Piet usually have more impact into more matchups. But against certain lists like Hondo and the mono yellow Hans that are running around now, the tech DJ stuff, it can absolutely ruin your opponent and single-handedly win the game on turn 3 or 4 by just skipping your opponent's turn. Traitorous is another one that into those Lurking TIE Phantom decks, it just absolutely blows them out. You can steal a super laser tech against the blue, green, black villainy mirrors, or like the control mirrors. You're not blue, green, but they might be. Stealing a super laser tech just wins the game on the spot usually. And even into Sabine, the Sabine greens and whatever other Sabines you're playing, it certainly has value in those matchups because just like a removal of a threat plus an addition of a threat on your board can swing the game completely in your favor. However, in those same Sabine matchups, if they ECL their Poe in and get rid of your Traitorous, that play automatically loses you the game. As well as in certain matchups like the more super control decks that don't have a ton of units, or maybe some of the more mid-rangey decks where once they get past turn 2 and 3, they're not playing many 3-cost units, and the ones they are playing aren't super effective. It can be good early, but oftentimes is a dead card. Relentless and Devastator are a little weird. I still consider them spike cards, but they're kind of some cards you associate with this deck because it's one of the few decks that can play these super top-end threats. But they're really, especially Relentless, is only good in specific matchups. A 9-cost 8/8 ship is a fine body, and the effect is very, very good. It's incredibly unique, but when you're playing against even like a Boba Green, Boba Yellow, especially like a Sabine Green, you're sliding both of these big boys out. But Relentless especially, I find, comes out a lot. But into those event-heavy control decks, this is just like the focus point of the game. It's such a pain point for them, and the whole game is around how fast you can get it out versus how efficiently they can remove it, at least at like the A-level game plan. Devastator is better into more matchups because I find it's pretty good into the Boba Yellows. I haven't played it too much against the Mono Yellow Han personally, but I'd imagine it's all right there. But there are certainly some hyper aggro decks that you draw this card and it's never getting played because you're going to be dead 3 resources before you can ever get this out. So what's the point? What's the difference between glue cards and spike cards besides what I just went over? So why would you play a glue card over a spike card? So like I said, the whole, or maybe I haven't said this yet. My brain isn't quite working this morning. But this game system with the resource system allows you to play more spiky cards. In the matchups where certain cards are bad, it's an instant, easy resource. And so it allows you to skew your deck in a couple aggressive ways, like a sideboard normally would in other card games, but just bringing those cards to the main deck. And so I'm allowed to play my Devastators and Relentlesses into a field that is 25%, 20% Sabine Green because I can just resource those cards, and I have cards like Command and Traitorous for those matchups. But I think obviously you can't just build a deck of completely spiked cards. Your deck needs an identity. And I think those glue cards are what give your deck their identity. Like Command, Emperor's Royal Guard, Vader, Reinforcement Walker. Kind of the deck's identity is set up walls early, ramp and buff into your late game threats of Vader to bridge the gap to endgame. So those kind of glue cards are laying out your game plan for your deck. So I was thinking bringing this back to Darth Maul, or just Maul, excuse me. He's not Darth in this card. But it made me think of, why am I bringing Maul into every matchup? And that got me to thinking of, well, my main deck has spike cards and glue cards. My sideboard could as well. And so, in the faster matchups, my spike cards are my Salacious Crumb and my Gamoran Retainer. These are like super good cards into aggro. They're, again, cheap cards are hard to be awful, just because you can play them early and they will do a thing, especially with Palpatine. You can ping them away. But especially into aggro, these cards are very, very good. Healing and Sentinel is what you want in those matchups. And so I can just switch out my Relentless and my Devastator and be on my merry way. Into the slower matchups, Scanning Officer, again, a weird one. You're not probably going to cut all three, just because a lot of the slower matchups have random smuggle cards that are very powerful. And if you're playing like a Hondo or a Han that are more smuggle focused, you want to keep them in. But Traitorous can also come out in some of these super slow matchups for these techs and these Palpatine's returns that are just late game grind cards that are always going to like keep your game plan moving forward and recur constant threats and just spike the biggest, best cards you have in your matchup. So I have Crumb and Retainer and Tech and Palpatine's Returns as my spike cards in my sideboard. But I still have one card left in my sideboard, Maul. It's a weird card because it's almost like it's a glue card that's in my sideboard. So for the faster matchups, I have enough cards to take out where I can just slot it in. It's a good answer. Not necessarily a good answer, but it's the best answer I have to Pose and Wreckers, and just can be a big threat and close the game out quickly. Because against aggro, once you stabilize the board, you don't want to give them too many turns to get back into it. You want to get them dead quick. Against control, I am okay siding out some of the cheaper units to just have bigger threats, more big threats, because that's really what matters. Even just a 7-6 overwhelm can be a big threat against those control lists. Into some of the decks in the middle there, they often have 7 health leaders or leaders that will die in one shot to Maul, so it's really powerful there. Basically, what Maul does how I think about Maul anyway, is it takes my curve and moves it whatever direction I need it to. So if I need to crunch my curve down, I can take out all my high end and then top out at 8 in Reinforcement Walker and just have this as a 7. If I need to move my curve up, I can then side out some of my cheaper, less effective Sentinels. Like maybe I don't need to ambush my Walkers very often, so I can trim on some Piets. And then I move my curve up to just be heavier threats and more threat dense. So what's the point of all of this? In my head, at least most decks I can think of in the meta right now have at least one spike card. Darksaber is a spike card for Sabine. Throwing that on Sabine leader can win you the game, but can also instantly lose you the game in some matchups. It may be controversial, but I think the blue-green villainy decks, Super Laser Blast is kind of a spiky card. In some matchups, it's exactly what you need, but in some matchups, you're never going to get there. In Kira specifically, that Halo Bond Enforcer, the 1/4 grit with a bounty, in the aggro matchups, it being able to trade for 2 units is incredibly impactful, but in like grindy mirrors, giving the opponent the card is just such a backbreaking thing. And your Boba Yellows, if you're running like the Dr. Evazons or the Boba's Armor or the Final Showdown, you could argue the Mercenary Gunship. I don't personally think that, but there are options in like a Boba Yellow list for some spike cards that can win you the game instantly, but also can be hard to play and aren't amazing in every situation. Like if you draw a Boba's Armor after your Boba's been deployed and defeated, what's that card doing? +2/+2 isn't going to be amazing. So I think it's okay to build your deck to be more spiky versus more consistent. It's just something I'm conscious of whenever I go to deck builds, because I believe it should influence the way you sideboard. I think the more consistent your deck is, the more you're allowed to have spiky cards in your sideboard, because spiky cards in the main deck are kind of already tilting you one way or the other, so you want to add a little bit more consistency for matchups post board. Whereas if you're a spiky deck, you already kind of have some pre-boarded cards in your main deck, and so you just want to bring in that extra consistency, and the consistent decks want to spike, if that makes sense. I already talked about this before, but remember, in a tournament setting, your sideboard is super important. It is part of deck building. Early on in a meta, oftentimes you want to just build a main deck to find out what ideas and what kind of decks are good. But once we get later into the meta and the meta starts to form a little bit, we're now learning. We've got our Boba Yellows, our Sabine Greens. Han Yellow is a bit of a surprise, but that's been good. Got our Blue-Green Villainy controls. Palp Green's still out there. Now that we have a meta sort of forming, we can start to construct our sideboards more thoughtfully. And everything I said here is not a hard and fast rule. It's just something I was thinking about just looking at my Maul on my sideboard. I'm curious what others think about it. This might be something that only applies to certain decks and only applies to the types of decks I build, but maybe it's something that can be applied across the board. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them down below. Let me know if there's anything you'd want me to talk about next. I love talking about this game. I love talking about specific decks. I might have an Afro Green deck tech coming up that I've been working on and throwing together. Won't be as in-depth as my last one because I have way fewer games with it, but I think it could be fun to share it. So once again, thank you for watching.